He stood at the edge of the wooden porch as the evening wind swept dust across the quiet frontier town, a man shaped by years of responsibility rather than hope, and everything about this day felt wrong to him. Not wrong in the sense of danger or failure, but wrong in how deeply it unsettled the careful order of his life because he had prepared himself to marry a woman of experience, someone closer to his own hardened age, someone who understood loss, survival, and the unspoken rules of a world that demanded strength above softness. Yet what fate delivered instead was a bride barely past girlhood, standing at a distance with her hands folded as if she feared taking up space, her eyes lowered not in defiance or calculation but in quiet uncertainty. And the moment he first saw her, a strange discomfort settled in his chest that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with fear, fear of failing someone so young, fear of being seen as a man who would take rather than protect, fear that the weight of his life would crush whatever gentleness still lived inside her. He had not asked for this match, but neither had he refused it. Circumstances rarely allowed men like him the luxury of preference. Years earlier, the world had taught him that love was a distraction, something that weakened judgment and made men reckless, and so he had learned instead to value duty, order, and survival, building his reputation as a man who did what needed to be done and asked for nothing in return. The town respected him for it, feared him a little too, and when the arrangement was made, half necessity, half obligation, no one questioned whether he was ready for marriage, only whether the girl was. She arrived with no entourage, no loud expectations, no dramatic tears, just a small bag and a silence that spoke louder than any protest could have. And when the preacher cleared his throat and gestured for her to come forward, she obeyed with the careful steps of someone who had learned early that resistance often made things worse. He noticed then how small her hands were when she placed them in his, how they trembled just slightly, not from panic but from the weight of stepping into a future she had not chosen, and something unfamiliar stirred in him, an ache, sharp and unwelcome because for the first time in years, he was painfully aware that power did not always look like cruelty, and innocence was not weakness but vulnerability placed into the hands of others. As the vows were spoken, his voice steady and hers barely above a whisper, he realized how young she truly was, not in years alone, but in the way she listened as if every word mattered, in how she searched his face not for promises but for reassurance. And when the ceremony ended, and the townsfolk dispersed with polite nods and quiet curiosity, the silence between them stretched uncomfortably long. He expected fear, maybe resentment, perhaps even defiance once they were alone. Yet what he received instead was something far more disarming: patience. She did not ask him questions he could not answer, did not demand explanations he had no right to give, did not cry or accuse or plead. She simply followed him into the house that would now be hers, looking around not with judgment but with careful interest, as though she were memorizing the shape of a life she was determined to understand. He told himself that this arrangement would be simple: two people sharing a roof, fulfilling expectations, maintaining distance, but that illusion cracked the moment. She thanked him quietly for waiting for her to settle before locking the door, a small courtesy he had offered without thought, and her gratitude struck him harder than any accusation could have. He realized then how little kindness she must have been shown in her life for such a basic gesture to matter, and that realization unsettled him more than danger ever had. That night, as she retired to the far side of the room with careful modesty and trust that felt undeserved, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to her soft breathing, confronted with a truth he had long avoided, that love was not always loud or consuming. Sometimes it arrived quietly, asking not to be taken but to be protected, and though he did not yet call it love, he sensed that something irreversible had begun. If this story has already pulled you in, if you feel the tension of two lives colliding under the weight of fate and quiet emotion, morning came gently, the kind of slow, pale dawn that softened even the hardest edges of the frontier, and he woke before she did, as habit dictated, lying still as though any movement might disturb the fragile peace that had settled in the room overnight, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to observe her. Without the armor he usually wore, how she slept turned slightly toward the window as if seeking light, her expression calm, unguarded, untouched by the calculations that ruled his own mind, and the sight filled him with a quiet unease he could not name, because it reminded him of everything he had lost long before. She had even learned how to want. He rose carefully, moving through the house with deliberate silence, making coffee the way he always had, yet finding his routine subtly altered by her presence, as if the house itself had begun to breathe differently now that it held more than one solitary life. When she eventually emerged, hair loosely tied and eyes still heavy with sleep, she apologized for rising late, though no rule had been set, and that instinctive self-blame struck him as deeply as a wound, because it revealed how accustomed she was to measuring her worth by how little trouble she caused. He told her she owed him no apologies, and though his words were simple, she looked at him as if they were something precious, nodding slowly, absorbing them as though storing them away for later comfort. The day unfolded with careful politeness, both of them navigating an invisible boundary neither knew how to cross, and yet in the smallest moments, something began to shift when he noticed her fingers reddened from scrubbing and wordlessly took the bucket from her hands. When she listened intently as he explained the quirks of the land, not interrupting, not pretending knowledge she did not possess, simply learning, she had a way of paying attention that made him feel seen in a manner he had never experienced before, and that unnerved him more than hostility ever could. As they worked side by side, he found himself speaking more than he intended, about the weather, the land, even fragments of his past, and each confession felt like a quiet betrayal of the man he had built himself to be, yet she received every word with gentle seriousness, never probing, never dismissing, only acknowledging, and in that acceptance he felt something loosen inside him, something that had been clenched for so long he had forgotten it could relax. The town, however, was less gentle, its whispers thick with judgment, and he sensed her awareness of it in the way her shoulders tightened whenever they passed others, the way her gaze dropped instinctively, and when a careless remark from a passerby cut too close, he saw her flinch before she masked it with composure. Rage stirred in him then, hot and unfamiliar, not because his reputation was questioned, but because her quiet dignity had been threatened. And in that moment he understood something vital, that love, or whatever fragile thing was forming between them, was not about possession but protection. That evening, as they shared a simple meal in near silence, she finally spoke of her past, not with bitterness but with calm honesty, and each word revealed a childhood shaped by obligation rather than choice, by obedience mistaken for virtue, and though she did not ask for pity, he felt it rise in him nonetheless, accompanied by a fierce resolve he had never directed toward another person before. He realized that her innocence was not ignorance but resilience, a softness that had survived despite everything, and for the first time, he questioned the hardness he had mistaken for strength all his life. When night fell, the space between them felt different, not smaller but warmer, charged with unspoken understanding, and as he lay awake again, listening to her breathe, he knew that something within him was changing, not because she demanded it, but because her presence quietly invited it. If you're feeling that slow, powerful shift, the kind that transforms hearts without force, the weeks that followed were a study in contrasts between the harsh demands of frontier life and the soft, patient rhythm she introduced into it, between the man he had always been and the man he was beginning to discover he could be, and each day brought new challenges that tested not only their bond but the limits of their understanding. He had expected compliance, a quiet presence that would follow instructions without thought or emotion, yet she surprised him at every turn with a clarity and gentleness that made him question his assumptions. She worked beside him in the fields, hands calloused already from labor, yet moved with a grace that suggested thoughtfulness rather than mere effort, and when he observed her, sweat on her brow and dirt on her fingers, he saw strength he had not anticipated, a courage that existed not in bravado but in quiet endurance. In return, he found himself softening in ways that were both exhilarating and terrifying. He laughed more than he had in years, sometimes over small things she did, a tilt of her head when puzzled, a soft humming as she worked, and each moment of levity chipped away at the walls he had spent a lifetime building. The townsfolk continued to whisper, their gossip sharp and unavoidable, but she faced it not with bitterness but with quiet dignity, teaching him a lesson in courage he had never needed to learn in battle or business, that bravery could take the form of patience, resilience, and humility. and that these traits could touch hearts far deeper than force or fear ever could. One evening, after the day's work was done and the fire burned low, she asked him to teach her to read, and he agreed with a mixture of hesitation and curiosity, not knowing that in the simple act of guiding her fingers over letters, he would discover the profound intimacy of shared growth, the thrill of watching someone blossom under your guidance without ever controlling them. Each lesson became a private sanctuary, a space where conversation flowed easily and slowly. He began to reveal pieces of himself he had never voiced, stories of hardship, moments of regret, glimpses of the loneliness that had shadowed his life, and she received them without judgment, with only the softest encouragement that urged him to continue. It was in those moments, quiet and unassuming, that he realized her innocence was not fragility but insight. She understood more than he had ever expected, not through experience but through empathy, and her presence illuminated truths he had long resisted. That love was not obligation, that patience could be revolutionary, that trust was not a weakness but the strongest foundation upon which two people could build a life. Then came the first real storm, fierce winds and driving rain that threatened to tear the barn roof loose, and as he worked frantically to secure the livestock, he found her at his side without fear, handing him tools, steadying his arms, offering small but meaningful suggestions, and in the midst of chaos, her calm courage grounded him in a way no man had ever done. That night, drenched and exhausted, he looked at her and saw not a child or a naive bride but a partner, equal in courage, strength, and heart. And something in him finally shifted, an acceptance that the future could be shared, that love could be more than passion or duty. It could be companionship rooted in mutual respect, admiration, and the quiet understanding that only time, patience, and innocence could foster. She smiled at him then, tired but serene, and he realized that the walls around his heart had begun to crumble, not because she demanded it, but because she had shown him a way to let go. As the fire crackled and they sat together in the warm glow of the evening, he thought about how life had brought him to a bride he had not expected, a soul young in years but wise in heart, and he understood finally that love was not something he could plan or control. It was something he had to embrace, quietly, fully, and without reservation. If this story of unexpected love, quiet strength, and life-altering companionship has captivated you so far, don't miss the final chapter. Time moved in strange, almost imperceptible ways on the frontier, stretching moments of joy and compressing moments of fear, and by the time the fourth season had begun to tint the hills with the first hints of autumn, he realized that the life he had once thought rigid and unyielding had been irrevocably altered by the quiet presence of a young bride who had entered his world, without fanfare, without demand, yet with a wisdom and patience that reshaped him in ways he could never have foreseen. Their days had settled into a rhythm that was both comforting and exhilarating, she rising with the sun, tending to the small garden that had become her pride, learning the intricate balance of livestock care, and he continuing his work on the land with her, always close, always attentive, teaching, guiding, and gradually, without his own conscious permission, learning himself to care in ways that were gentler than necessity or duty required. He noticed, too, how the townspeople had shifted their perception of her, once dismissed as naive, now regarded with a quiet respect earned through diligence, humility, and courage, and in her reflection, he saw the profound truth that the heart of a person could change more than any reputation, that love could elevate not only the individual it touched but the world around them, however small. One evening, as the sky burned with the deep reds and oranges of sunset, they walked along the ridge overlooking the valley, and he found himself speaking not as a man of authority or obligation, but as a man moved by gratitude, by admiration, by the realization that he had been wrong to doubt the power of innocence to teach, to soften, to awaken. She listened as she always did, with eyes wide and earnest, and when she finally spoke, it was not to praise or console, but to share her understanding, her own quiet insight into his struggles and fears, her words bridging the space between them with a sincerity that made him ache with something he could now recognize as love. That night, when they returned to their home, he watched her prepare the modest supper, her movements calm, deliberate, filled with purpose and care, and in the small domestic scene, he recognized the depth of their bond, not the stormy passion of young romance, not the calculated comfort of arrangement, but a love that had grown through observation, respect, and the subtle, powerful influence of her quiet innocence. He realized that the lessons she had taught him were not just about love, but about life, about patience in hardship, courage in vulnerability, the beauty of allowing oneself to be changed, and the strength found in gentle understanding. The final revelation came one winter evening, as snow fell softly outside, blanketing the land in quiet white. She had grown more confident in herself, more assured in her place beside him. Yet her humility remained intact, and he understood that this delicate balance of innocence and wisdom was the very essence of the love that had blossomed between them, a love he had never sought, never expected, but that now defined the entirety of his existence. They stood by the fire, hands brushing, eyes meeting in a silent acknowledgement of everything they had endured, everything they had discovered, and everything yet to come, and in that still, intimate moment, he felt the full weight and joy of what she had given him. The gift of understanding love not as conquest or possession, but as a living, breathing connection that nourished both hearts equally. As the story of their journey comes to a close, remember this: sometimes life delivers lessons through the quietest souls, and love emerges in the most unexpected forms. If you've been moved by their story, if you've felt the transformation, the courage, and the gentle power of unexpected love, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because stories like these remind us that love can teach, heal, and inspire, and you won't want to miss the next tale that promises to touch your heart in ways you never imagined.